So again, like I mentioned, this is coming out of the work by the Settlement Services Working Group at the Toronto South TSLIP as one of a series of actions to respond to racism, specifically anti-Black racism and its overt and systemic realities in the settlement sector. So this is one of those steps that we are taking. Words like anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and social justice are being used more commonly, but there is still a need to kind of engage with what they mean and what they mean for different contexts, and that includes the community and settlement agency sectors as well. So today is meant to be a foundation for continued and future learning and for invested and deliberate action. So I invite you also to be present today. Please resist as best you can the lure of your mail inboxes and engage and sit with what comes up for you, the work to identify, and also work to identify the power that comes from any privilege or access you may have that can impact change in your organization, in your programming, with your funders, and within your own communities. So I'll leave it there from my end, and I'll pass it over to Rana.
Unmuted? Yeah. Hi, I'm so grateful that we're starting off our conversation this way. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. So I always like to start this way. We know that Indigenous peoples are the original title holders and the stewards of these lands and waters, and that they've resisted colonialism in so many ways for centuries. So their efforts deserve our active and our dedicated solidarity. And I just want to drop a couple links in the chat. So these are a couple of ways that you can support Indigenous sovereignty right now. The Six Nations Land Defenders have been organizing to stop a development on their territory at 1492 Land Back Lane. You might have to copy and paste that link. I see it didn't turn blue. And on Wet'suwet'en territory out west, people are facing violent arrests as they defend their land from a company called Coastal GasLink that is trying to drill on their territory to build a pipeline. So in both cases, we know that the dispossession of Indigenous people from their lands is a defining feature of colonialism. So is the violence and the theft of resources that accompanies it. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in a bit. I'm just going to introduce myself and go through a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. So my name is Rana. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a Palestinian artist and facilitator. I'm currently working with the Decent Work and Health Network. We're an offshoot of the Fight for $15 and Fairness that focuses on health as like as a determining, as decent work as a determining factor of good health. And I also spent many years running facilitation programs with a group called Next Step, so social justice, environmental justice focused facilitation. And I personally came to these lands as a refugee in exile from Palestine. But in around 2006, my family reclaimed citizenship to Palestine. So since then, I have been living back and forth between these lands and the occupied West Bank. I grew up on Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa, which is also where I learned a lot of the stuff that we're going to be sharing today. And I just want to thank the stewards of all the lands that we're hailing from today, everything those lands have taught us and allowed us to learn. So I'm going to really encourage folks to use the chat function. We're going to keep people muted for this part just to avoid technical difficulties. But the second half of the workshop will be smaller discussion groups, and you'll have lots of time to be vocal and to participate more directly. I'm going to be posting a lot of links as we go. So hopefully Jesse could confirm. I hopefully will be able to send out all the links as an email. Do we have folks' emails?
Yeah, so we'll definitely be following up with a brief evaluation, but then we'll also include the resources, slides, any of the materials, links that are shared here today with everybody.
Okay, great. Because I have some really long links that I want to add. And I will still put them in the chat just so you can see kind of what I'm referencing, but hopefully you won't have to furiously be copying and pasting. I'm going to say that, you know, personally, I like to use a journal. We're going to have a couple of self-reflection questions. You know yourself best, so whatever you find helps you self-reflect, absorb information, just create that environment for yourself. I'll also say that since we're going to be talking about oppression and racism, this presentation could be triggering to you. So at any time, if you need to, please step away from the screen, do whatever you need to do to support yourself. And to give you an idea of what we're gonna expect, I will be going over the agenda next. So finally, this is a learning space. All of us are learning, which means that it has to be a space where we aren't afraid to make mistakes or to challenge each other's mistakes. And I think that will come up a lot more once we get into breakouts, but I just wanted to put that on the table. Okay, this is our kind of long agenda. We're going to be going over oppression and anti-oppression. We're going to use this learning tool called the taking tree. I love metaphors and learning tools like this. I find them really helpful. Maybe it's the poet in me, but I hope that it's helpful to you guys as well. We're going to break down the logics of these kind of 4 pillars of racism: anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, Orientalism, and border imperialism. This is just one way of conceptualizing it. There are so many different ways that we could have, but this is the one we're going to go with today. We're going to talk a little bit about resources extracted through racism. We're going to do a bit of a self-reflection on privilege and oppression. I'm going to introduce another tool called the iceberg model, and then we're going to break out into groups. One of the groups is going to talk about how racism manifests institutionally, individually, and culturally in the settlement sector. And the other group will talk about how we confront those things on those 3 levels. Okay. Let's jump in. So what is oppression? Humans are really diverse people, and we come in so many different shapes and expressions. Our ways of knowing and expressing, they vary vastly, and our relationships and families and ways of loving are all different. But when our diversity is replaced by a supremacy that enforces a hierarchy, that becomes oppression. So there could be probably infinite ways that we define oppression. I like this way. There's also a famous quote from Bell Hooks that says, being oppressed means the absence of choices. We could make it as complicated or as simple as we want. This image here, the triangle, is called the oppression triangle. So you can see it's constituted of history. It's held together by 3 sides: the individual, the cultural, and the institutional. And in a way, it's also an upside down pyramid, because the institutional is being held up by the cultural and the individual. So keep this triangle in mind. We're going to come back to it later. And like with all the metaphors or the learning tools that I proposed today, take what's helpful, leave what isn't. As I said, we all learn differently. And, you know, for some of us, this will really resonate, and others, it won't. So on the other hand, what is anti-oppression? Abolishing oppression would address the 3 sides of the triangle. It has to be systemic, it has to be cultural, and it has to be individual. It could look like empowerment, healing justice, education like we're doing today, the building of alliances, the changing of policies, the reincorporating of diversity. Concepts of oppression and anti-oppression have to come out of this searching for intersectionality. It really started in the early feminist movement from those who were experiencing multiple forms of oppression, and they felt they weren't being served by that early feminist movement. So in particular, Black women challenged the feminist movement to join them in challenging racism as they would sexism. And if you want to learn a little bit more about that, Bell Hooks's book, Feminism is for Everybody, is such a good read on the topic. So the need for intersectionality was pushed for by queer, trans, non-binary people, racialized people, people with disabilities, so on, because they experienced multiple forms of oppression. And they understood that they couldn't just pick one part of their identity to fight for. So all of this to say, not just that different types of oppression exist and overlap, but actually that they're fundamentally intertwined. They feed off of each other. So hence the famous quote from Martin Luther King, "We're not free until everyone is free." And Angela Davis is also often quoted as saying, "Justice is indivisible. You can't decide who gets civil rights and who doesn't." I'm going to get Jesse to pull up the taking tree. We're going to go into this metaphor right now. It's a prezi. Do I have to stop sharing?
No, I'm good. Or you're good here.
Okay. Actually, now that I'm out of sharing screen, I can see all of the people on the call. Okay. So let me just put this in the chat.
Just want to confirm you can see the slides on my screen. Okay.
All right. So this is a metaphor called the taking tree that we're about to go into. It was developed by Lucayo Estrella, a really brilliant facilitator who has trained so many of us in anti-oppression over the years. I dropped their website into the chat if you want to learn more about them. So let's look at another way to understand oppression and liberation. This is the story of the taking tree. So once upon a time, in a land not so far away, in other words, this land, next slide, there was a group of people who had dreams filled with gold and greed, power and bloodshed. They put those dreams into a single seed and they called it the seed of empire. So what is imperialism? Imperialism is the system of domination and subordination. It has an imperial center and a periphery. So when we talk about the oppressive ways that our world has been shaped today, we're talking about European imperialism, which was spread throughout the entire world through 500 years of colonialism. Next slide. So the roots of the taking tree are always hungry, and they feed by taking power. So the roots are the very oppressions that we're going to be talking about today. And each of them has their own single-minded purpose, something we call an oppressive logic. So these logics are something that are historically formed. Each oppressive logic looks something like this: supremacy, which you can, simplify into group A is superior to group B, plus violence, meaning so group B must be killed / enslaved / fought or so on by group A. So a big chunk of these roots make up what we call racism. And today we're going to break that down into 4 different sections. These are not comprehensive, they're not mutually exclusive. Many people will experience multiple forms at the same time, but I do find this a really helpful framework for understanding the historically constituted thing we call racism or white supremacy. Next slide. Okay. So anti-Black racism is often given this definition: a set of beliefs, attitudes, discrimination against people of Black African descent that are entrenched in individuals and systems, a result of history, and the experience of enslavement and colonization. Now, anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism was historically formed through this oppressive logic that claims that non-Black people are superior to Black people, so Black people must be turned into property. This was the guiding logic of European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade that has shaped the world that we live in. It's also the anchor of capitalism, which commodifies all workers along a racial hierarchy. Now, the 13th Amendment in the United States, which banned slavery except for in prisons, allowed for Black people who had been enslaved by the slavery system to be re-enslaved by the prison system. And anti-Blackness as a logic was and is the guiding logic of the prison system. And if you want to delve into that more specifically, a really useful resource is the documentary The 13th by Ava DuVernay. I think it's on Netflix. I'm just gonna make sure I can see the chat. So if I say anything that is confusing and you want clarity, please just write into the chat. Okay, so slavery was practiced in Canada. A lot of people don't know that because we aren't taught that. It was practiced in Canada for 206 years. And anti-Black racism in Canada is still deeply embedded in our institutions and our practices. Trying to pick what I could talk about in this short period was really difficult. One of the things I pulled up is the racial wage gap. It's a really small example of how we see this play out. Black men make 66 cents on the dollar of white men. Black women make 83 cents on the dollar of white women, and about half of what white men make. If you delve into any measure of wealth and labor, you'll only see this pattern replicated. And here, let me break down a few examples in the way that Lucayo has here on our screen. So on the institutional level, police profiling, violence, police-driven murders, a disproportionately high incarceration rate, deliberate impoverishment and neglect from the state. I'll add that that happens through things like environmental racism. Now, environmental racism is the ways in which neighborhoods populated by certain racialized groups will be burdened by hazards like waste dumps, like industrial factories, chemical factories that lead to a lower quality of life. There's, I have a bunch of resources I'm going to paste in a sec. There's a really great book on this practice in Canada by Ingrid Waldron. It's called There's Something in the Water. And I think Elliot Page made a documentary based on the book as well. That's on Netflix. And right now, of course, through the pandemic, we're also seeing the result of state neglect through the disproportionately high COVID contraction and death rate of Black folks in Canada and the US. Culturally, we see anti-Black racism through things like the erasure of Black history before slavery, the appropriation of Black culture and language, blackface, segregation in Nova Scotia, and the destruction of Africville in 1964. Personally, I might have put that last point under the institutional heading, but for those who don't know, Africville was a Black community in Halifax that was forcefully displaced, then razed to the ground in 1964. It's also a 200-year-long example of redlining. Now, redlining is another concept. It's the practice of banks outright denying mortgage loans to people based on their race or the neighborhood that they live in. Two things that are pretty intertwined. Redlining is how ghettos were created and reinforced. It also goes hand in hand with environmental racism, because when the city decides to put a dump or a prison in your neighborhood, like they did in Africville, then your property becomes devalued and banks consider your assets worth less, and then they don't give out mortgages. It's a way of keeping certain populations clustered together and unable to progress past their economic standing. So in other words, to keep the poor poor, the rich rich, so on. I'll also add, because here on the slide it says segregation in Nova Scotia. I'll also add that Ontario also had separate schools for Black children in the 19th century, but the last racially segregated school in Ontario did not close until 1965. I mean, this is not ancient history. And 1983 in Nova Scotia. Individually, we see things like the use of the N-word, racial stereotypes. I'll add microaggressions to all of the next categories we're going to speak about. Microaggressions, if you're not familiar with the term, are everyday insults, indignities, demeaning messages, like being followed around in a store, like being ignored in a professional setting, or not being seen as a professional, or being expected to be the spokesperson for your entire race. So many things. I'm sure so many of the folks on this call experience microaggressions every day. So it's a good term to have there. It's also important to remember, we're looking at this slide. Anti-Blackness was formed through white supremacy. And so non-Black people of color hold a proximity to whiteness that puts us on the privileged side of anti-Black racism. So Black folks have really pushed us to question terms like people of color that homogenize all racialized people into this one blob, as if we're all experiencing racism in the same way, which we're not. And of course, to best understand anti-Black racism, we have to look to Black voices, thinkers, activists. So I'm posting a bunch. Oops. Try that again. I'm posting a bunch of books and shorter articles from folks in Canada. Okay. I don't know why I can't do that. It's not working. So I guess I'll just email it after. But just to give you an idea, it includes Robin Maynard. Her book, Policing Black Lives, is one of, I think, probably essential reading in Canada. There's a couple articles from Sandy Hudson, from Desmond Cole. There's the book by Ingrid Waldron on environmental racism, and a book by Grace Edward Galabuzzi on Canada's economic apartheid and the social exclusion of racialized groups. Okay, next slide, please. How's the pace going so far? If anyone wants to put anything into the chat, so I feel like I'm talking less to myself. Okay, so since no one said anything, I'm assuming the pace is going well. Let's talk about settler colonialism. So the oppressive logic of settler colonialism is that settlers are superior to Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples must have their land taken. Now, this is a logic of genocide. It argues inherently that Indigenous peoples must always be disappearing in order to allow non-Indigenous peoples to have rightful claim over this land. Now, Canada, most of us, I think, would know, is a settler colonial state, and it was established on land that was already inhabited and governed when European settlers first arrived here 400 years ago. The nation state, the borders, the government of Canada that we know today, it was only created through the theft or coercion of land. In cases where treaties exist across this country, we can look at every instance and see how they were made either in bad faith, under duress, without agreement about the terms. And we can also see how today Canada either fails to fulfill treaty rights or just outright violates them. And then there's great swaths of land in Canada that are unceded, a word that means they were never sold or negotiated away. So by Canada's own legal measure, they were never legally handed over to the Canadian state. That includes, I think, like 97% of BC and the Maritimes. It includes Ottawa. Ottawa itself is unceded, and Parliament was built illegally on Anishinaabe burial grounds by Canada's own legal measures. In order for the land and the resources that it holds to be taken, in order to bolster the Canadian state, Canada had to systematically wipe out, assimilate, or disenfranchise the Indigenous peoples of this land. So this happened through multiple things. So we saw this happen through multiple things, including the Indian Act, the pass system, the destruction of Indigenous families through residential schools, through the 60s scoop, Canada's reserve system, which siphons Indigenous peoples onto small pieces of land that are not arable, so they can't be, so that they can't live sustainably off of those pieces of land, and which fragments them from each other and from urban centers. This model was borrowed by the architects of South African apartheid and later by apartheid Israel, because they saw it as a very effective model to fragment Indigenous communities so that they wouldn't be able to resist the theft of land. And of course, it bears saying, Indigenous people have continued to resist despite, these major obstacles. So again, we recognize many people who are racialized that are impacted by racism can also be settlers who are on the privileged side of this oppressive logic. In my case, I can recognize that although I arrived on these lands as a refugee, and that although in my homeland in Palestine, I'm an Indigenous person deeply impacted by colonialism, on these lands, I'm a settler who benefits from settler colonialism at the expense of Indigenous peoples. This includes things like access to land and property that was stolen. access to services that are not available to people who are governed by the Indian Act, and so much more. In the end, to understand these oppressive logics, we have to look both at histories and at present realities. So I'm gonna just try again to drop some links, but maybe there's something going on with my computer. It doesn't seem to be letting me. No. Okay, so I have a bunch of links that I wanted to share that include articles, podcasts, and books. It includes some stuff by, for example, Pam Palmater, who has a podcast that you can follow. Tanya Talaga, who writes about how there's two Canadas. Nick Estes is a wonderful author, thinker. He has a book and a podcast as well. And Thomas King, The Inconvenient Indian, is a very thorough account of Indigenous history in North America. So let's look at how Lucayo breaks down this logic. We see settler colonialism manifest institutionally through things like police profiling, brutality, and murders, a disproportionately high incarceration rate, deliberate impoverishment and neglect from the state, and Canada's Indian Act. On that note, I would say many of us know that the RCMP was created in the late 1800s to police Indigenous peoples. Its actual goal, it was called the Northwestern Mounted Police at the time. Its actual goal was to uphold this newly founded dominion called Canada. And that meant specifically controlling the Indigenous population and facilitating the transfer of their land to the new colonial state. That history is still fully present in what we see of the RCMP today and in the violence that we see against Indigenous peoples across this country. We spoke about environmental racism on the last slide. We see that very plainly in Indigenous communities across the country. I have some stats. So today, 73% of First Nations water systems are at medium or high risk of contamination. There are dozens of water advisories in First Nations communities across the country, many of them in Ontario, and some of them date back 20 years without clean water. Culturally, we see things like the erasure of Indigenous history, pre-colonization, redface and using Indigenous peoples as mascots and costumes. I would add things like the celebration of Canada 150, which was, the talked about thing a couple years ago. Indigenous youth led this movement, rebranding it as 150 years of Indigenous celebrations of 150 years of Indigenous genocide. And I would say, I've mentioned the word genocide a few times. I have this quote from the Truth and Reconciliation report that says, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. And this they call cultural genocide. Next slide, please. I see Resin said pace is going well. If anything changes, just let me know. So, Orientalism is a term that was coined by Edward Said. He argued that Europe created concepts of the East and the West precisely so that the West could subjugate and control the East. The fundamental logic here is citizen is superior to foreigner, so foreigner must be fought and conquered. Now, in defining itself as a superior, more civilized civilization, the West had to constantly construct itself in opposition to an exotic, but always inferior Orient. And when we say Orient here, we're referring to all parts of the world that are not considered part of the West. Some people use terms like the global South. Now, the logic of Orientalism, it marks certain people or nations as inferior and as posing a constant threat to the well-being of the West. This logic doesn't racialize people as property or as disappeared like the last two that we talked about, but it does imagine them as potential foreign threats. This logic really is evident when we look at xenophobic or anti-immigrant movements in Canada, in the US, in Europe, in Israel. In particular, this comes up during times of war. This logic really gets evoked, and immigrants of color, no matter how long they've been here, become targeted. Orientalism is the anchor for war and the military-industrial complex. It allows countries like the US to justify being in a constant state of war in order to protect itself from its enemies. So despite a reputation to the opposite, Canada, the Canadian military is very deeply tied to the US military. We have hundreds of working agreements with the US military. So even when Canada is officially not at war, Canadians are at war and our weaponry is at war. So in Iraq, for example, Canadian officials and warplanes and so on were there in Iraq, though the country wasn't there. So this happens through agreements. There's one called NORAD, that's an acronym. It's the biggest one. But beyond that, Canada is one of the top arms exporters in the world. So we are deeply, deeply, deeply invested in the war industry around the world, whether or not our reputation as a peacekeeping country or whatever, you know, our country profits from war. Just last year, this was all over the news, we sold $14 billion in weaponry to Saudi, and this was used in the brutal war against Yemen. I don't want to get too off track. I just really want to emphasize how Orientalism is rooted in the profit of war, whether we see it on the surface or not. So if you can see on the screen, I'll go through the way that Lucayo has broken down institutional, cultural, individual. So at the institutional level, police profiling, brutality, police-driven murders, high incarceration rates, deliberate impoverishment and neglect from the state. Canada's passed Chinese head tax, which for 40 years put a tax on Chinese immigrants entering Canada, and then banned Chinese immigrants altogether for 20 years. Internment camps for Japanese people, where tens of thousands of people were detained. So in internment camps, tens of thousands of people were detained under the War Measures Act for the duration of World War II, and their homes and their businesses were sold by the Canadian government. Security certificates targeting brown men post 9/11. Security certificates, if you're not familiar, are this mechanism that allows the government to detain and hold non-citizens living in Canada without an open trial, without open evidence. So everything can be done in secret. And it's a very criticized mechanism that exists under our law because it completely skips past, what's the word? It basically completely evades a person's civil rights in the name of national security. Okay, so culturally, the idea of conflating all brown people as terrorists, terms like the Asian invasion, fetishistic responses to Japanese culture. I would add ideas of foreigners as less civilized, including things like the assumption that immigrants are not LGBTQ friendly, or that their women are oppressed and that their men are oppressive. Now, these ideas not only hide the fact that this society is also a heteropatriarchy full of oppressive realities, but it also is, it's a justification that has been used in the name of invasions. in the name of controlling other people, and so on. Really recently, we see, for example, Trump calling coronavirus the China virus or the Wuhan virus, and really working that term into his agenda of painting the East as a threat to the West. Individually, we see things like racial slurs, like yellow fever, stereotypes of the exotic East, and so on. So again, it is not letting me paste things, so I'll just tell you what's in my list of resources, and you'll get it later, I guess. It includes Edward Said's book, Orientalism, but also there's a video called On Orientalism. It's one of those videos that I've watched about 100 times because he just does such a great job of making it something that's kind of easier to digest. And there will be a couple of other articles, including, for example, this very extensive resource list on how to address coronavirus racism. So next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. So I'll say until this point, Orientalism, it isn't a term that you often hear in other breakdowns of racism. I'm pretty sure that this model that Lucayo has developed borrows from this concept called the 3 pillars of white supremacy that Andrea Smith developed. She breaks down white supremacy as having 3 different pillars that she categorizes as anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, and Orientalism. And she argues that what keeps us trapped in our pillar is the seduction of, like, we become seduced by the prospect that we can profit or get an advantage from one of the other pillars. So the call of that model is basically to join forces against all forms of oppression as the only way to be free.
There we go.
Is everything good, Jesse? I just heard something. Okay. So Lucayo here has added a 4th sort of pillar or 4th section of the roots called border imperialism. And this is a more recent term coined by the South Asian organizer and author Harsha Walia. She's based in BC. And border imperialism not only looks at how borders restrict people, but also the racist ideologies that emerge alongside the closing of borders that we've seen over the last few decades. Here's a quote from Walia. Migrants are not seen for their actual humanity, but instead as a problem to be prevented, deterred, managed, and contained. They become stereotyped by politicians, media, and within popular consciousness as floods of people from over there who are disease-ridden, fraudulent, or security threats. These narratives buttress moral panics about keeping borders safe and secure from poor and racialized migrants. That's the end of the quote. Now, borders are not natural lines in the landscape. They're not apolitical. They're artificial constructions that are then enforced by militaries, by citizenships, and other forms of control. So in our world today, if you become a refugee, if you lose your citizenship, it is incredibly difficult to ever gain citizenship anywhere else. The number of stateless people in the world is growing every year. And because in our global world order of nation states, your rights are tied very closely to your citizenship. If you cease to have a citizenship, you cease to have anyone who will defend and assert your rights. Now, border imperialism is something that we understand not as one country's anti-immigration policies. It's actually, like, the concept of it is as a global system of power. It's rooted in slavery, colonization, and othering, which are the 3 processes we've just talked about. The oppressive logic of border imperialism, as you can see on the screen. Citizen is superior to migrant or undocumented person. So undocumented persons or migrants must be turned into property and or fought and be conquered. Talking so much. This will be, we're gonna get breakouts soon. Okay, so the institutional forms of border imperialism, the ones that we have listed here: indefinite immigration detention in Canada. So many of you probably know this since you're working in the settlement sector. In Canada, we can hold migrants in prison indefinitely. If they can't produce papers establishing their identity or the documentation that they need in order to be deported, Canada can hold them for as long as it wants in low security to high security prisons. Most countries, including the US, I believe, have a reasonable time limit on how long migrants can be detained if there's no chance of them being deported. Canada doesn't. So there was a very infamous case of one man called Kashif Ali. He was a Black West African man. He was born to Nigerian and Ghanaian parents, but he didn't have papers in either of those countries. So he had been here since the 80s, and Canada was trying to deport him, but no country would take him. He spent 7 years in a maximum security prison in Canada, even though he was never convicted of a crime. And he spent a great portion of that in solitary confinement even. Thousands of people are detained every single year in Canada for immigration reasons. And because it's indefinite, unlike a trial that convicts you and gives you a set amount of time, detainees don't actually know how long they're going to be in there, which is a whole other form of psychological punishment. Okay, to continue. So the forced deportations, lack of access to healthcare, something that has become painfully clear during the pandemic. I keep getting off topic, but well, it's on topic, but I keep going on little tangents. Here in Ontario alone, we saw, the major outbreak among migrant workers on Ontario farms. We saw, I believe, 4 migrant workers die here, away from their families. And in Ontario, when this outbreak first happened, and there was, I think, 400 confirmed cases, the Ontario government said that migrant workers who were asymptomatic could continue working. Not could, but should. I mean, the kind of, anyways, I just felt like I needed to point this out, that we're really seeing this now in this pandemic. Probably every single form of racism we've spoken about has been amplified and really made clear. Culturally, we see things like the framing of people as illegal, the framing of people as stealing jobs from the economy and money from welfare. In other words, the reduction of migrants to their ability to contribute to the economy. Individually, we see things like racial slurs, mocking accents, taking advantage of people's unfamiliarity with the system. The resources that I'll share later include Harsha Walia's book, Undoing Border Imperialism, where she maps out this concept really well. There's an article that I would also say is really, really essential reading by 3 authors called Why No Borders. And there's a couple articles on the indefinite detention that we spoke about and the people and groups that are pushing to end it. Okay, next slide. These are the intertwined sections of the roots of this taking tree. We've broken down these 4 sections. They're not comprehensive or mutually exclusive. I think I said that already, but I feel like I need to keep saying it. They overlap, they intersect. In this metaphor, the roots merge together. They're not distinct sections. They merge together underground because oppression is interconnected. So indeed, our experiences of oppression and privilege vary vastly, but our liberation is tied together. So put in another way, what we know as racism or white supremacy are social norms are social norms that are enforced by violence and internalization to ensure that the best or the largest quantity of resources goes to those coded as white. And the resources that we're talking about are labor, land, and war. We spoke about the theft of labor in the logic of anti-Blackness, the theft of land in the logic of settler colonialism, the profits of war in the logic of Orientalism, and labor, land, and war in the logics of border imperialism. Now, Jesse's just going to swipe through these slides just to give you an idea of how much vaster the roots are. There's this section on cis heteropatriarchy. There's a whole other section on disableism, which you'll see the charity model is under ableism. And having also worked in the settlement sector for a couple of years, I thought this was kind of interesting, seeing how the charity model really emerged from the logic of ableism. It's a model that assumes that people who are marked as incompetent have to be cared for as property. And it includes as an outcome, for example, things like the creation of a codependence between people who need services and NGOs, where the vast majority of funding goes to the NGOs and not to the community. And there's very little invested in a future where this relationship is not codependent. Keep going. There's so many other forms of supremacies. If you really wanted to, you could map out the taking tree with, probably an infinite amount of subcategories among the roots, including classism, faithism, like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, ageism, languageism, sizeism, and so on. So from the roots of the taking tree grows a trunk, and the trunk is made up of institutions. So I'm going to ask you to drop in the chat, what are some examples of institutions? Institutions are things that are social structures. They govern our behavior and they exist beyond the people who founded them. Institutions are things that have their own spaces, their own language, their own terms, their own policies. Schools, awesome. Yep, education is a major institution. Social service centers, yes. Anyone else? I'm going to take a sip. Hospitals, yes. Prisons, absolutely. Ministries, yes. Okay, maybe next slide, let's show them the list that Lucayo made. You guys got about half of these. Yeah. Yeah, education, medicine, you could break these down, higher education and lower education, not lower, but, schools versus universities. They all have their own different sets of language. Even in medicine, you could break down mental health care to other healthcare. They're all institutions. So I'll read them out in case you can't see the slide. Education, medicine, law and legal systems, the military and paramilitary, police, mass media, industry or commerce, civil society or NGOs or social welfare. Settlement sector could be its own institution. It depends how detailed you want to be. Okay, next slide. So, did we skip a few slides? Oh yeah, so just one. So from the trunk of the taking tree grow branches that eventually bear fruit. And this fruit is the product of all the institutions that make up the trunk. Now, different individuals have different experiences when they eat the fruit of the taking tree. So we're going to take a couple minutes for self-reflection. I'll say 5 minutes and I might run to the bathroom. But here are some questions I want you to consider. Who can like, can you see the roots of the taking tree? What happens to people who eat the fruit of the taking tree and are on the right side of the fruit of the root supremacies? And what happens to folks who eat the fruit of the taking tree and are on the wrong side of the fruit supremacies? So take a moment, write something down for yourself. You can share in the chat if you like, and we'll come back in, say, 3 minutes, 2:03. Alrighty. I hope you guys were able to write a couple things down. Let's go through the answers, Jesse. So the first question was about if people can see the roots of the taking tree. And in this metaphor, the answer is no. The roots are underground. We only interface with the trunk and the institutions, or the trunk, which is the institutions, and the fruit. So unless we're talking about it, unless we're educating, re-educating, these roots are invisible. We see them only through our interaction with things in our society, like the institutions, like other people. For example, as certain racialized peoples trying to get help from the police or trying to access services through an NGO, and our experience, our success or our failure with trying to do those things. Next slide. What happens to people who eat the fruit of the taking tree and are on the right side of the root supremacies? They experience privilege, which we can define really simply as an unearned advantage. Lucayo's listed things here like the American dream or the idea of this good life, safety and security, inclusion, access to services and employment, internalizing affirmative and positive messages. Next slide. And what happens to people who eat the fruit of the taking tree and are on the wrong side of the root supremacies? They experience oppression or an unearned disadvantage. This can manifest as things like being at risk or marginalized, physical violence from police, from the health system, through lack of housing, so on. It can manifest as exclusion or a lack of access to services or to spaces, and as the internalization of negative messages and self-hatred. And that first one, at risk, may resonate a lot for people on this call. I know that when I worked in the settlement sector or resettlement sector, at risk and marginalized were these kind of key terms that were used to design programs. And maybe that's something we can talk about more in our discussion groups. Next slide. So put in another way, those who enforce supremacies are oppressors. Those who gain from supremacies are privileged. Those who suffer violence, isolation, and internalization because of their diverse ways of being are oppressed. And it is possible for us to be both privileged, oppressed, and an oppressor. It's possible for us to be a combination of two. It's possible for our position to change in different contexts. And I'm going to end the Prezi at this point and come back to my screen. Let's see. Okay. Wow, I just talked a lot. So let me just pull up the chat so I can see if anyone writes anything. Okay, so just a very quick recap of the metaphor. The seed is empire. The roots are the oppressions. The trunk is institutions. The fruit is how the oppressions impact us. And the taking tree's roots are hungry to expand and to consume other trees, other cultures, and other civilizations. This consumption, this process of constantly seeking to grow and consume more, happens through colonialism and capitalism. Next slide. Oh, this is me. Okay, just a recap of the oppression triangle, just in advance of our breakout groups. It's an upside down pyramid where the institutional is held up by the cultural and the individual, and the triangle itself is constituted of history. And I just wanted to introduce this model as well. Some people find it helpful. It's the idea of an iceberg. So it's just another way of thinking about oppression and how we respond to it. So like an iceberg, the boulder that we see in front of us that's above the water is only a very small part of the actual structure. And in the iceberg model, it's suggesting that the deeper on the iceberg that you respond, the more leverage you have. So if you're only responding to the event that you see on the surface, you know, the microaggression that happens in your work staff meeting, you're only getting the opportunity to respond at the immediate reaction. Not to say that response isn't important, but it's a way of thinking where we, you know, the deeper we go, we can transform and design alternatives that actually lead us closer to an anti-racist society. So on the iceberg, you know, the part we see above is the events, the actual things that we see in front of us. Underneath the waterline is the patterns, the events that we see repeating, the trends. Below that, we see systems. The systems feed the patterns. They're what create these trends. And then underneath that is mental modes. And these are the values and assumptions that we hold that allow for this deeply oppressive system to continue. So something also to think about and maybe to get to talking about in the breakout groups is what is the implication for service providers if we're thinking about it this way. So we're going to get into breakout groups, and we are going to take a quick break right before, but let me introduce them and tell you a few things before we take the break. So there will be two groups. One group will be with Jessie and one group will be with me. Jessie's group will talk about how we see racism manifest in your sector, in our sector. And my group will talk about confronting and challenging racism. In both cases, we're going to break it down individually, culturally, and institutionally, just as a way to make sure that our approach and our conversation is holistic. And then we're going to have one person from each group hopefully volunteer to take notes and to present back to the plenary when we get back. So let's take a 5-minute break. Before you go, Jessie's gonna put us all into the 2 breakout rooms. And we're just gonna ask that you accept the invite into the breakout room before you leave for your bathroom break or whatever. And we'll reconvene 2:15 to start the breakouts.
We spoke about how at the college, students, there may be even a bias on the part of people who work with students. If you mention you have a particularly demanding student and you tell the experience, almost inevitably you'll be asked, oh, where were they from? And, you know, so if you mention a certain part of the world they're from, people kind of would, you know, roll their eyes like, like, you know, we know those people can be difficult. There's also immigrants can belittle themselves and sometimes think that their education doesn't matter here, or their work experience, that their past doesn't matter. But then at the same time, institutionally, they can join a workshop for employment, and they're told that, you know, to not put down their education because they may appear overqualified, or it makes you too much other, and just to include your Canadian experience. So the valuing of degrees, sometimes people just don't mention that they have a degree simply because they don't think that you'll value it. One person in the group told a story about an internationally educated nurse who was white, who was talking about how amazing it is that there are these services provided for those people that need it. Meanwhile, she's internationally educated herself and didn't seem to see herself as part of the others, that she didn't belong there, was kind of the sense. And institutionally, funding controls what we can do, who we serve, and especially specific newcomer or immigrant groups. Some groups are technically not considered newcomers, so opportunities may not be there. And also, settlement workers decide on their own or on our own what resources we share and what information to share, and that's based on, you know, the settlement workers often their own assumptions with only knowing somebody for, you know, 10 minutes or so, and you may end up having them miss out on multiple opportunities because you just didn't really delve deeper into who that person is.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Rezan, do you want to report back for our group?
Sure. So our group talked about how to confront racism. So on an individual level, we talked about confronting like what we know and being open to learning and confronting what we've been taught either here in Canada or whether we are newcomers ourselves or settlers ourselves to learn what we've learned elsewhere. We don't, like Rana said, we don't see the actual system unless we talk about it. So it is really important to be having these conversations. But as Giovanna said, it's not enough to just have conversations in spaces like this. They need to be happening in all spaces, particularly those where big decisions are being made that impact others' lives. We need to stand up and confront racism when we see it, even the micro, all the way to the microaggression to the big systemic challenges that we face. And then on a cultural level, we talked about changing the narratives among newcomers, especially because we work in the settlement sector, and teaching them about violence and racism right here in Canada, and not to imagine it as something that Canada is not involved in. So talking both about the history and also about the contemporary challenges that people face here. And allowing people, particularly newcomers, to feel grateful, but also be allowed to be critical. So there's this notion of like, you're here, you're a newcomer, you should be grateful for what you have, you shouldn't question things. And it can be quite scary to confront that. And it's very silencing at the same time. So some suggestions on an institutional level that would kind of overcome this cultural notion is, I believe, as Maha and another participant suggested, we have, you know, link school training, and it's based off of teaching obviously newcomers language skills. But what if that language allowed newcomers to develop the vocabulary and to talk about the concepts that we are discussing here today, to create more spaces to allow newcomers to engage in this kind of dialogue from the start, so that they are aware both of what's happening to people who live in their communities, but also how to face challenges that they may be facing with racism. So both, you know, how to support others, but also what can they do on an individual level to seek support if they're facing any racism or violence. Other things we talked about on an institutional levels is that there needs to be an investment in groups that are doing action, that are implementing initiatives that are community-based and are informed by community needs, as opposed to well, no, then we're getting into my own personal opinion, so I guess I just will skip that. But yeah, so that's kind of like the tiers that we talked about and how we can confront racism.
Thank you so much, Rezan and Tracy. And I hope you guys had, you know, talks. I felt like that half an hour went by like this, which always ends up happening. I want to just share a couple slides before we completely break off. So ahead of the workshop, I just tried to brainstorm a little bit myself, using these three pillars, like individual, cultural, and institutional, which something that someone said in one of our groups, I think it was Rezan, about how it's really difficult. It can be difficult for some people to think this way because you feel like actually everything I can think of fits into all three categories, which is a good thing. The categories aren't meant to divide things. They're just meant to make sure we don't leave anything behind. So on the individual level, One thing we could talk about is bystander intervention. Is that a familiar term for folks? I like that now I can see your faces so people can nod. Before I felt like I'm just talking to my computer. Yeah, so one thing I like to say with bystander intervention, you know, if you're sitting on the bus and someone starts yelling a racial slur at someone, something happens when you're walking down the street. One of the rules of thumb that I use personally is to completely ignore the person who's harassing and to just talk to the person who's being targeted, ask them if they want you to support them or what they want to do, instead of standing in front of them and saying, I'll defend you, you know? That kind of replicates those, one thing we haven't talked about as much, which is the savior complex that sometimes happens. Ask the person what they want. It's also a safer way to engage if something's happening. Educating yourself and your community forever. It always is something that we're developing and learning. Learning from diverse sources, because we all learn differently. We all teach differently. There's a lot that we can learn if we engage with different sources. Practicing self and community care. Challenging microaggressions, assumptions when they happen. Validating and supporting the experiences of your Black, Indigenous, and racialized colleagues when they speak up in your work meetings, instead of saying, actually, I don't see that. I don't really think that's true. Validate them. People don't bring things up. It's very difficult, it can be, to bring things up in professional spaces. Validate them, support them, stand with them. I put not calling the police because we know that that can have deadly consequences for a lot of people. So being very conscious about when and if you ever call the police. On the cultural level, are folks familiar with the idea of a sanctuary city? If you look up sanctuary city, there's—
Sorry, Brenda, I just want to quickly just be cognizant of, the time. So I know we're at time, but we'll continue on and just kind of finish up these last few points. But if folks feel like they, if you need to leave, it's totally fine. Please feel free to do so. I just want to quickly say before anyone does leave that I will be sharing a brief evaluation, and then all the resources that Rana has shared or intended to share, I'll share with everybody during their email, in an email as well.
Thank you, Jesse. I'll just be a couple minutes, but yes, feel free to leave if you need to. So sanctuary cities or institutions are places that provide services to people who are undocumented. So provide services without asking or requiring documentation. It's a way of making sure that no one is left behind when you're providing services. Having diverse representation, this came up in our groups. This includes whose voices are heard when you get media opportunities, whose faces are seen on your posters, whose images are seen in your graphics, who is in leadership roles and decision roles in your organization. Implementing anti-racist policies and using those policies as a starting point for conversations that have to happen continuously. Ongoing anti-racist education. This phrase, nothing about us without us. If you're planning to run a program in a certain community, are you designing it alone or are you designing it with the community? Nothing should happen about a certain community without active and meaningful, and I would say compensated consultation. Ensuring events and services are thoughtful about diverse participation. So we talked about anti-racism, but I'm also thinking not just about, you know, diversity in terms of race, but also ability, sexuality, things like that. So making sure you have diverse options when you're filling out forms, making sure you have translators, making sure you have like food options that are appropriate, things like that. Confronting and challenging language that is rooted in supremacies. So some things, you know, slurs, I think we can see really overtly as problematic, but there's a lot of other things, like the fact that we call it the settlement sector. I don't know if your group talked about that, Jesse, but there's certain languages that we could confront and use as a point to change the way our mental models are, as the iceberg model said. Ooh, tongue twister. Building alliances, we talked about that in our group. So, you know, if we have like a youth group with, I know we did this in Ottawa, Jesse did actually, having our immigrant and refugee youth programs meeting and exchanging with Inuit and First Nations youth here. Building these alliances, having exchanges really has, can have a profound cultural impact. And on the institutional level, I would say joining, supporting, funding, and fighting for systemic change. I've listed a bunch of Toronto-based grassroots programs or movements that you could support either with your time, with your money, with learning what they have to say. Most of them have a way that you can support them. And I would say things like divesting from companies complicit in war is another really institutional way that you can support anti-racism. So this is something we often call socially responsible investment policies. So pushing your organization to adopt an SRI if your organization's invested in anything. So most universities, for example, have hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in companies based on how profitable they are. Many universities have started to adopt an SRI, which keeps them out of companies that are military companies, tobacco companies, environmentally destructive companies like fossil fuel companies. An SRI basically doesn't invest in anything that has no future because it's too destructive. Redistributing resources, creating alternatives, organizing transnationally, so not keeping it within the borders of Canada or North America, but also thinking and organizing and connecting with people in the global south. So I'm trying to get through all this before 3:05. Right now, there's a really good opportunity for institutions, organizations to do something. Just a couple days ago, this historic declaration to divest from policing and prisons came out, and Robin Maynard has been posting it, and I can share the link, but it's a shared statement that's looking for organizational support. Now, my workplace, we signed on as one of the early signatories. Our work is not directly about prisons, it's not directly about racism, but we did make a commitment to anti-racism a long time ago. And so we stood up when this call came out and we got our organization to sign on. And that is my contact information. If anyone wants to reach out to me after, I'm just going to share the link, if it lets me, to that declaration.
Great. Thank you so much, Rana. A lot to think about, a lot to engage with on a continuous basis going forward. And I don't want to take up too much more time. I really appreciate everyone for making the time to be here today and being putting yourself in the situation to have a conversation about this. I know it's on everybody's mind and something that we're really looking forward to continuing, especially within the Toronto South LIP and all our LIP partners and community partners. So please reach out to myself. You have my contact information, as well as Rana, who shared her information there as well, with any follow-up questions or anything else. But we do want to leave it there and just thank everybody for joining us.